2020 is the craziest year ever, and investors are not quite sure how to react. In this video, we're going to look at how stock market might react to a possible Joe Biden or Donald Trump win, and how the election itself might affect the stock market. Let's first take a look at how exactly investors are predicting the outcome of the election. There's a few contradicting signals, but we can go through a few of them. The first is that overall the stock market is obviously up in 2020, which a lot of people wouldn't exactly predict, considering that it's the worst employment situation perhaps since the Great Depression. So a lot of these investors are still pouring money into the stock market, which suggests that they think Donald Trump might be the winner. Why is that the case? Because whenever the stock market is up in an election year, it usually indicates that they think the incumbent is more likely to win because they know what the incumbent is likely to do in the second term. Now, if it's down, that means that they think the opponent might be more likely to prevail because they don't know exactly what the opponent to the incumbent is going to do in their first term. So, of course, whenever there is lack of clarity or ambiguity, then investors are more likely to pull away slightly from the stock market. So this indicator works about 87% of the time in elections, that the stock market going up favors the incumbent. On the flip side, when we look at the Biden portfolio and the Trump portfolio, the Biden portfolio is ahead. What does this mean? That means those stocks that are likely to benefit from either a Biden presidency or a Trump second term, those are the two portfolios that are competing. And it looks like so far Biden is ahead. So overall, the stock market is up, but when we look into specifics, the Biden portfolio is doing better than the Trump portfolio. So these are some contradicting signals, which indicates that perhaps the election is going to be a lot closer than we really think it is, according to the opinion polls. Now, one big question mark over the election is what is going to happen on election night. And this is unprecedented because we have so many mail-in ballots that are, and early voting that are going to obviously affect the race. So as those mail-in ballots are being counted, is that going to draw out the election results? And could there be an election night that looks like a Trump win that could turn into a Biden win after these ballots are counted? These are all questions that we won't know the answer to until election night and possibly weeks later. Nonetheless, we do know that if there is a lot of dispute, if there's many disputes on election night, then and going forward, there's probably going to be an injection of volatility into the stock market. And we can see that this is probably true based on the 2000 election. So on November 7th, 2000, we saw a pretty significant decline in the S&P 500. We also saw an even bigger decline in the NASDAQ. So in the year 2000, stocks weren't doing so well already. So this might indicate that the election was just throwing an already weak stock market into further disarray. But in the long run, it seemed like the election was not one of the main drivers of the stock market in the coming months after the election. Now, when it comes to election years, for the most part, the stock market does grow in an election year, and there's only a few examples that contradict this. 2000 and 2008, in the most recent memory, are the most dramatic examples. Of course, in 2008, it was a very significant decline because of the housing bubble. But most election years have gains, and that is no exception in 2020, despite the craziness of this year. Now, a few things that we should consider when we think about the contested election. The first is, will the Supreme Court weigh in, and does the Supreme Court making that decision have any effect on how investors are going to feel? That's probably not the case. I doubt that if the Supreme Court is getting involved and they make a decision one way or the other, that's going to be a real driver of volatility itself. I think the election being contested at all is what's going to drive the volatility. I don't think the Supreme Court making a decision one way or the other, is probably going to be the deciding factor for volatility in the market. Now, if Trump makes some sort of dramatic move, and of course, it's difficult to predict what exactly Trump will do, I think that's more likely to have an effect. So if the Supreme Court's not getting involved, but Trump tries to unilaterally do something, whether it's with mail-in ballots or whatever he's going to do, I would be nervous about volatility going forward in those coming weeks at least. Nonetheless, it is expected that in early December, no later than early December, those mail-in ballots and any kind of contest between Donald Trump and Biden should be decided by that point. So there will be a period of volatility, but hopefully we will see that will subside after all those votes are counted and after any drama in the Supreme Court goes one way or the other, that volatility will subside. Now, in the long run, most analysts say that the election doesn't actually have much of an effect on the stock market. And actually, it's usually the other way around. The stock market plays a bigger role in deciding elections than elections do in deciding the big trajectory of the stock market. But that's not to say that there is no effect at all. On average, Democrats tend to perform slightly better than Republicans on the stock market, but that's not to say whether or not Trump specifically or Biden specifically would do better, or if they really have much of an impact at all. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Biden and Trump portfolio, because I think that's an important way for us to understand the longer term implications of the election. So for the Biden portfolio, green energy is a larger aspect of a Biden presidency, of course, than Trump. So those stocks are performing better than normal, and that's because those investors are bullish on a possible Biden election. This is because in Biden's campaign, he's proposed a $2 trillion climate change action. So, of course, any climate change policy is going to include some sort of green energy, and so those green energy stocks are doing better. On the flip side, Biden in the past has talked about limiting fracking or limiting fossil fuel use. So if Biden were to win, then of course those stocks will probably go down. And in the healthcare sector, it's more of a question mark. What are the Democrats going to try to do in healthcare? And what is this going to mean for pharmaceutical companies? Will they try to limit drug prices? Will they try to offer a public option as Biden has proposed? And what exactly will that public option look like? How will it affect the overall medical industry? That's not clear, but most investors think that the proposals coming out of the Biden campaign are not so disruptive. But of course, if there's a Democratic sweep, both in the Senate, the presidency, and the Democrats hold the House, then I'm thinking there's going to be a lot bigger push for more dramatic changes to the medical industry. But that's all just speculation. When we look at the Trump portfolio, of course, Trump just generally supports lower taxes. Biden proposed raising taxes and getting rid of some of the Trump tax cuts and raising taxes on higher earners. So for Trump, generally, a lot of these companies are going to see a slightly lower tax rate under a Trump presidency in all likelihood, and less regulation. So Trump is a big fan of using executive orders to get rid of regulations, and that, of course, will be positive for those companies that are affected by those regulations. Not necessarily positive for society as a whole, but positive for those companies. When it comes to some other companies that might be under the target of a Democratic administration, like student loans or private prisons, obviously those would do better under Trump because Trump is less interested in reining those in as a Democratic administration would be. And of course, Biden has made proposals and the Democratic Party has made proposals when it comes to waiving some of those student loans. So Under Trump, those stocks would probably continue as they are, but under Biden, those might be harder hit. Now, there is some interesting common ground between Trump and Biden that should be noted. Trump has indicated his willingness to do an infrastructure bill, but over the years, it has been difficult to get through the Republican-led Senate. So if there is a blue wave and Biden and the Democrats take the presidency and the Senate, then it's more likely that an infrastructure bill is going to move forward. Now, if the Democrats take the Senate and Trump holds the presidency, I also think that there's an increased likelihood for an infrastructure bill, because that's one of the things that Trump has tried to find some common ground with the Democrats, but he's never been able to thread that needle between McConnell and Pelosi. For the stimulus package, that's been something ongoing between all sides, and Trump has signaled some willingness to have a really big package. McConnell can't do it because of Republican opposition in the Senate, and Pelosi won't do a small package. She has basically refused to do any kind of targeted or skinny bills. So if there's a lame duck, or if there's a continuation of Trump, what does that look like for the coming months? If they can't get the stimulus passed before the election, does that mean Trump is able to pass it if he wins? If he loses, does that mean he just gives up and doesn't try to pass anything? That remains to be seen. So we'll see in the coming months how exactly the election dynamic is going to affect the stimulus. Nonetheless, it's fairly likely that if Biden were to win, then he is going to pass a new stimulus in the new year, especially if nothing is done before the election. There's also an interesting aspect about antitrust. Trump has kind of moved the party towards more skepticism of the big tech companies. So there's this strange common ground that's taking place with Democrats. And Republicans are also complaining about some of the targeting of Republicans by these tech companies. So there's a greater willingness to take on these big tech like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. So whether Biden or Trump wins, there could be some action that takes place against those big tech companies to maybe limit some of their business activities, or even split them up in a more dramatic action. That's all speculation. So we'll see what a Biden administration might look like, or a Trump second term might look like in terms of targeting those big companies. Does Trump want to take on Amazon? It's possible. Last is China. China's an area that is lacking clarity from both sides, actually. It's unclear if Trump is going to be continue to be as strong against China, or if Biden wants to be strong on China, so to speak. We don't really know until that occurs, because in an election year, both want to appear strong on China when it comes to trade and other areas like human rights issues, but it's not quite certain if Trump is going to push China as hard in a second term, or if this is just an election year sort of issue where he's distracting from what is perceived as his own domestic failures by pinning it on China. Is he going to pull back from that? Does he want to go for a bigger trade deal in the second term? He said that he is not interested in a trade deal right now because of what happened with China. So that's all yet to be seen. But it's unlikely, whether it's Trump or Biden, that we can completely put that cat in the bag and go back to normal business with China. I don't see that as happening. So it's likely that even a Biden presidency is going to have to challenge China in some areas. And Biden has said that he would challenge China on some trade areas. So What does that mean in terms of the stock market? Well, those companies that are more exposed to the areas that are targeted will likely have to find some sort of alternative, or they could be harmed by those types of actions. Now, what that looks like, it's unclear, but of course, Trump has been very persistent on trying to bring down Huawei, and it looks like if that continues under Biden, Huawei is not looking so great, at least in their European in the European market, because Trump has made it impossible for Huawei to use Google and to contract with some of those semiconductor companies like in Taiwan, and use other American intellectual property. So is that going to broaden under Trump's second term? It's possible. Would that broaden as quickly under Biden? I doubt that Biden would be as quick to move as Trump has been. But I think that some of the sort of slow-moving action that we saw under Obama is more likely under Biden. But nonetheless, I do see that there's going to be some more restrictions on China, whether it's Biden or Trump. Now, Biden has said, though, that his focus is going to be on outcompeting China rather than just decoupling from China. So there is some difference in style, and that's going to translate into difference in strategy, practical implications as well. So it's likely that that type of movement will be much more rapid under Trump than it would be under Biden. I think Biden is going to be much more hesitant and a bit more anxious to do any big moves against China. Now, whether it's Trump or Biden, I do think the U.S. will try to move closer to East Asian alliances like Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, because there's a lot of technology over here, and it's likely that they will use those relationships in order to reduce exposure to China while also continuing to build up America's technological base. So there is a lot of common ground. There is some splits on key areas like climate change and taxes. But the key in the near term is, what does this election look like? How is Trump going to react? And how are investors going to react to what is likely going to be the most interesting election in my lifetime, at least? So if you have any comments, or if you have any ideas about what exactly is the stock market going to do in these coming weeks, and if Biden wins or if Trump wins, what is that going to look like for investors? I'm interested to know your opinion. Thanks for watching.